Well, good afternoon. Happy Friday, April 19th. Mark Milam here, your mortgage professional. Not my favorite week in the world of mortgage interest rates. We continue to see the 30-year fixed tick up into the high sixes, perhaps even the mid sevens, depending upon how many points you pay or don't pay. That has really been exacerbated by strong manufacturing data, a labor market that remains resilient. We've been talking about this for a couple of years. We don't expect to see any weakness in the labor market when you have about 11,000 people per day in the United States turning age 65, and that's forecast to continue for the next several years. You've got a lot of retirees exiting the workforce, creating a labor shortage. We are just not going to see weakness in labor, and if that's what the Fed's waiting for, we're going to be waiting for a very long time. But let me take you back a little more than 60 days ago to early February and some comments made by our Fed Chair Jerome Powell. This article published by the Associated Press back on February the 4th, not that long ago. We're in mid-April. This is taking us back a little more than 60 days ago when the Fed said, hey, we are on track to cut rates this year with inflation slowing and the economy healthy. If we scroll down the page, we can see Fed Chair Jerome Powell said in an interview broadcast Sunday night that the Federal Reserve remains on track to cut interest rates 3 times this year, a move that is expected to begin as early as May. Folks, that was February the 4th of 2024. Fast forward to this week, and we have different comments from our Fed Chair Powell saying there has been a lack of progress on inflation this year. And he goes on to say that Powell's new stance that we are not going to be cutting rates anytime soon is a departure from comments just 2 weeks ago when Powell offered assurances that the overall outlook had not changed much despite some hotter than expected readings at the start of the year. So we've got a very contradictory Fed that the market is really starting to discount, because we've just seen this before from our Fed chair. We have seen them speaking and often contradicting each other and saying one thing and then doing another within a very short time window, whether that's 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. We have seen this before from our Federal Reserve. And dare I say, the markets are really starting to discount some of this. What are the markets actually counting on? Well, let me show you some data that it seems our Fed chair has been ignoring for quite some time. And I want to start right here with the U.S. personal savings rate as a percentage of disposable income. So if we go back pre-pandemic, this is the pandemic right here, this line that's really spiked up. This is when no one could really spend money on anything because you weren't traveling, you weren't going out to eat, you weren't going to concerts. So the savings rate peaked here in April of 2020 at 32%, meaning of all the income that you're bringing home, you're actually saving 32% of it. That was a record for the United States. If we go back pre-pandemic, we can see that for the decade that preceded the pandemic, our savings rate in the United States averaged about 6.1%. That means for all the income you had coming in from your pay, from your investments, however you derive income, you were saving about 6.1% of that income. And that was very steady and stable, as you can see, for the entirety of the decade of the 2010s. This is post-pandemic, where the savings rate has dropped more than 2 percentage points down to about 4%. People are simply saving less. So what are they doing if they're not saving? Well, they're spending. This is personal consumption expenditures as a percentage of GDP. Again, this is pre-pandemic right here. We can see that our personal consumption expenditures were averaging about 67.5% pre-pandemic. Here's post-pandemic. We're averaging 69.2%. Americans are not saving, they're spending, which tells us there's been a fundamental change, a fundamental shift in how Americans behave since the pandemic. Why has this happened? Well, maybe it has something to do with the fact that the federal government allowed everybody to put their mortgages or their rent into forbearance. They could put their student loans into forbearance, and they would send checks in the mail into your mailbox for thousands of dollars. Perhaps the federal government actually taught Americans that you don't have to save, that we've got your back in the event that there's another recession. Perhaps we've been sort of conditioned by our federal government to save less and spend more, and maybe that is the driver behind inflation. And our Fed, which can't seem to understand that, is only making matters more confusing and worse. 60 days ago, we think we've got inflation under control. We think the Fed's going to cut the Fed funds rate 3 times this year. Fast forward here to mid-April, and now we think inflation is going back up, even though we had a 0.1% miss on the consumer price index, and the Fed tabling any talk of rate cuts until maybe Q4 of this year. Of course, we've got a lot of ground to cover between there and now. Ultimately, though, what we have here fundamentally, folks, is a change in Americans' behavior. We are simply spending more and saving less. And you only need to look at how we compare to the other industrialized nations. If we compare ourselves to Japan, Canada, the Eurozone, United Kingdom, or Germany, our projected GDP forecast as we move throughout the year here is going up substantially. These other industrialized areas are coming down. Americans' behavior has simply changed. The consumer has changed, and they're spending more. And perhaps if our Federal Reserve could understand this fundamental truth, they could reset expectations of what inflation should be now in a post-pandemic era. Perhaps 2% isn't the appropriate target for inflation. Perhaps it should be something different as we move throughout the entirety of 2024 and into 2025. If I can be of any service to you over the weekend, don't hesitate to reach out. Mark.Milam at HighlandMTG.com.